of folks coming on to today's webinar. The interest in the topic, I'm sure, is part of it, as well as we're really thrilled that this is the first time in 4 years the 4 national partners have sat down together and are putting on a webinar together. We have representatives from the partnership, from CAP-LAW, from NCAP, and NASCASP here today. We are all focused on a big advocacy campaign right now, right? We're always talking about CSBG, we're talking about the value and impact of community action. We're always talking about what we're doing in the field and the outcomes we're achieving and helping our families achieve. And today's webinar is really how do we take social media and take it up a few notches. We've done webinars called Twitter 99 when you're not ready for Twitter 101. But today's webinar is Social Media 201 because there is a baseline assumption that folks are somewhat familiar with social media, that you may have accounts on a variety of social media platforms that we're going to be talking about today. And how do we use those platforms to effectively tell the story of community action, the unique role of the Community Services Block Grant specifically. We're going to touch on using social media to both tell our story, but also talk about reauthorization and HR 1655. How do we do that in our network in a way that is impactful, but also recognizing the rules and regulations and limitations that we have as federal grantees, but also what can we do with our non-federal resources. There is a tremendous amount that we can do in community action, both to tell our story and to help support HR 1655. We are recording today's webinar. However, I just want to let you know that we will stop recording before the Q&A session. We want to make sure that folks have a chance to ask questions that they want to be open and candid with, and we want to make sure to give folks that opportunity. So we are recording the presenters portion of today's webinar, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the slides after today's webinar, as well as a link to the recording. As we go through here today, please put your questions in the Q&A window or the chat window in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will be collecting these as we go through the presentation, compiling the information, and we'll be posing those questions to our panelists later on in today's webinar. Also, if you have any technology issues, you lose connection, you lose audio, those things happen, and we've had a lot of IT issues here this week, so our apologies if we go blank all of a sudden. We'll do our best to get back. But if you have any technical questions, Natalie Kramer is behind the scenes today in our chat window, in our Q&A window, and you can chat with her there or email her at nkramer@communityactionpartnership.com if you run into any bumps along the way. So let's move on to the next slide. So in May, we just finished Community Action Month. What a fabulous month it really was. All 4 partners collaborated on resources, on toolkits. NASCASP, NCAP, and the partnership came together on 3 mini toolkits over the course of the month, maybe even 4 mini toolkits on sample tweets, sample stories, sample Facebook posts, all sorts of great stuff. And we really saw social media kind of blow up with hashtag #BeCommunityAction. It was really wonderful to see. Every day I would refresh my Twitter feed and there'd be 50 to 100 new items in my feed. So it was just tremendous to see how folks highlighted the power and the promise of community action. And you really made poverty a prominent piece of the conversation in May. And we know many of you do this year-long. It's not just a May activity. We know many of you use hashtag #TalkPoverty, and we hope that you will continue to use hashtag community action. And I know when we have our events at the national partners, we oftentimes have special hashtags there too, which we'll be talking about here today. Next slide, please. So in communications in community action, we do a lot of interesting things, right? We're using social media, our websites, our communication tools to do a lot of different things. We need to communicate to our customers, right? People are using social media, their smartphones, the web, to figure out where do they need to go to get the best possible assistance, the easiest point of access in their local community. So you use communications in that way. We connect with our partner organizations in our local communities. Nationally, it's much easier nowadays to keep abreast of what's going on at the regional level, at the state level, and at the national level. We certainly highlight our outcomes and what we're doing in terms of being impactful. We communicate with the broader general public. We certainly communicate with our funders, and we know that policymakers pay great attention to things that are going on in the media landscape, both in social media and old school print and radio and television communications as well. And social media is nice because it offers a broad-based appeal. It can really be some low cost. It certainly isn't free. Staff time is certainly an investment, but in terms of old school having to print off and doing a lot of communications by print resources, we know that social media offers us some efficient and effective platforms. Next slide. So today's goal, we're here to talk across all 4 of our organizations in terms of storytelling, CSBG reauthorization, and again, the rules and regulations. We have, I think, a great panel for you here today. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to be starting off with Ray Tamblyn from NASCASP. I hope that many of you have seen their great storytelling resources up on the NASCASP website. We have a number of those up in our TNTA Resource Center as well. They do a lot of training on storytelling, a lot of webinars. If you haven't seen those materials, I hope that you'll take a look at them. Ray will be walking us through some of the core elements of good storytelling. We have Eleanor Evans, the Executive Director and Chief Counsel over at CAPLA. Many of you have been in Eleanor's sessions, and I've been with Eleanor many times when we've talked about advocacy rules and regulations and what we can and can't do around lobbying. So we're thrilled to have CAPLA be with us today to talk about some more of those core elements. I know a lot of us get concerned, and she's going to show us what the green light is and what the red lights are. So we're thrilled to have her with us. And we also have Amy Kalmbach from NCAF, who is really, as many of you met her in March, and saw the great presentation she did on the use of social media and the use of communication tactics and strategies to address CSBG reauthorization. And she's going to talk to us specifically about HR 1655 and the great work that we can do across our network. And again, put questions in the Q&A window. That part will also is not shown necessarily, so we'll be able to take those questions, go through them, and we'll frame them over to the panel at the end of today's session. So keep those questions coming throughout the webinar as they pop into your head. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ray, who's going to be walking us through storytelling with community action and CSBG. Ray?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and sitting in on this webinar. We really did see a huge outpouring of energy and activity on social media when we did the Community Action Month. And as Denise mentioned, just being able to view in all in one place all of the different elements that you all are running and funding and serving the communities and all of the different outcomes that everyone was really able to draw from and highlight. So my name is Ray Tamblyn, and I'm the Research and Communications Analyst at NASCASP. And so for those of you who are not necessarily as familiar, we do sort of represent the role of the state CSBG administrators, and we are also here for the community action agencies at the local levels as well. So we work in coordination with all of the national partners here to really represent you all here on the national level. And so when it comes to telling a community action story, telling your story can be quite difficult because you all do so many different things, and you may be known in your communities by 1 or 2 programs, or maybe the one that makes the biggest splash. So, for example, some of you may be known as the Head Start office, but you might also be running a bunch of other different programs. And so oftentimes, telling your story has to be a strategic process. Since you don't have the one thing that you do across the board, picking and choosing your programs and your outcomes becomes a little bit more important for community action than it may be for an organization that does the one thing and has a consistent story and data elements. And so when it comes to that strategic messaging, the first thing you're really going to want to ask yourself is, to whom are you actually trying to message? What is your elements of the story, and to whom are you speaking? And so when it comes to policymakers, the story and the messaging that you put forward might be different than a funder or your clients or even the media. And so learning about how to message and frame that to different targeted audiences can be a little more challenging for community action agencies than if I'm a policymaker, I might need to frame things a little bit differently than for, let's say, a local newspaper. So next slide, please. That brings us to different levels of content promotion. So occasionally what works for one messaging audience might not work as well for another one. So if I'm trying to reach my clients and I know that I'm serving a rural community that might not have internet access, I might not be as focused as a community action agency on social media or doing things on the web. I might be focused much more on letters to the editor, hard publications, things that my clients can receive in the mail if I'm focused on publishing my services, my programs, and gathering client information. Whereas, let's say most of your local newspapers have an online web-based daily news type situation. In that case, you would be framing things letter to the editor, and you'll be putting more things on the web. And so just at the core is being aware of your audience and how they'll access your information. So if most people are on the internet that you serve or that you're trying to reach out to, then by all means do focus your staff time onto the internet. But if you know that most of the folks you're trying to reach, let's say to publish a new service or to accept applications for a new program, and your clientele are those who are using mostly hard copies of content, you know, being aware of those basic elements of your messaging and content promotion is really key. And it sounds like something that's common sense, but oftentimes we're so focused on keeping up with the latest technology that we sometimes forget that some of our clients are not necessarily on the web, or that the journals are not necessarily using letters to the editor anymore unless it's in an online format. So just keeping that in mind, I think, is one of the biggest steps for how to tell our story successfully and get sort of the goals behind the messaging. Next slide. So getting that message out. In addition to knowing who's going to be using which platform, the biggest question is to ask, what do you want to say? Because we can talk about so many different things. You know, do we want to just create awareness about what it is that you do? You know, are you trying to promote yourself within the community so that you're seen as more than just Head Start, more than just the SNAP office? Are you trying to reach out to your local legislators? Are you trying to reach out to someone that you're hoping to be a new community partner? Are you trying to publicize the fact that the needs in the community have shifted? Are you trying to really focus everyone's attention on the great successes and outcomes that you've had within the community that you might not have publicized before? Are you trying to get funding? Are you trying to do something else? So these are the kinds of basic questions that's really important to ask. Who, how, and what is your message? Next slide. And so messaging really matters. Next. So messaging really matters in that messaging is equal to action. So based on those goals of your messaging, it's really going to be, do you want to act? Do you want someone to pick up the phone and call you? Do you want to receive applications for your new program? Do you hope that someone reads your news article and is really interested in becoming a funder? Are you hoping to publicize the next, 5K? We saw a lot of one-time community events that you all were running during the Community Action Month. So are you hoping that people will promote your event? Are you hoping that people will attend? So knowing that really the core goal of the action behind your messaging, is it knowledge, is it action, is it funding, is it a change in legislation or policy or a new partnership, these are all elements that are really going to drive that messaging. Next. And so once you've gotten sort of to that core understanding of to whom are you speaking, what are you hoping to speak about, and what the goal of your speaking is, that's when you get to the picking your story. And oftentimes you might end up doing it backwards because you have a story that you're really excited about, and so you try to tell the story to everyone. And the danger in trying to tell the story to everyone is that not everyone is going to get the same message from it. So that brings us first to the framing element. And the framing element is really important because if I'm writing to my local legislator, I'm going to frame the element of my story differently than I might be to a local news article who's really interested in that first story, that first sentence, grab the attention. So I might use something that pulls more to the emotion of a newspaper article versus for my local legislator, I really want to drive home the fact that these are the people who are voting for him, or these are the constituents that she's representing, versus if I'm trying to reach out to my clients, I want to really quickly demonstrate the need that they might have and how I fill that. So just that framing can totally change who's reading and who's actually accessing your story. So you really want to set up your story in a way that draws the people in so that they hear the message you want. And we often talk about the implementation and the outcomes. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because sometimes people really want to hear the individual success stories. They might want to really know what happened to George from the minute he walks in your door, successes and programs, and what happened to George. Whereas other people, let's say a funder or a larger funder, they really want to know what you're doing as an organization. So George is simply an example of all of the innovative best practices, the models that you're running, the programs that you're running. And so if you pick George and you talk about George, you're accessing a different audience with your messaging than if you talk about the programs and George and another 50 people just like George have achieved all of these outcomes. So knowing the difference between sort of the organizational and the services story element versus the individual story element can also shape the way that people are able to access and share your stories. So somebody might want to know about George, and other people might say, okay, so you've served George, what about the other 5,000 people that you're serving on a daily basis? So keeping these elements in mind when you're trying to go through and frame your story, if you are able to access, whom you're speaking to, and usually once you've decided who you want your audience to be, it's going to fall into place, how you're promoting that content, the types of stories, the kinds of elements that you're including in the stories, and also those different outcomes and implementations of new programs or things that you're running on the ground. These are all really going to fall into place relatively easily in terms of a content promotion strategy. But if you start with the story, it's really difficult to work backward to decide who you want to now access the story. So generally speaking, it's going to be easier to pick the person or the audience and then shape your story around what works best to access that audience. So you might even be able to use the same story about a new innovative program, and you'll be able to use that same story to reach policymakers, the media, your clients, and funders, but it won't be the exact same story. So it sounds like a lot of work to be tweaking and modifying and targeting, but as we see day in and day out, all of the targeting, we all know that our clients come in with totally different needs, and everything needs to be adjusted and modified to fit the need. So this is simply another extension of modifying and targeting an implementation strategy on how to best achieve an outcome. And so this is just another example of how we're using our data and definitely working to achieve an outcome. So if my outcome is to reach clients and advertise that I'm accepting applications for a new program, by going through this advocacy, this outreach process, I'm able to achieve the outcome of getting more clients, whereas if I want to reach out to a policymaker, I'm also going to be targeting that to achieve that outcome. And so knowing your audience and the outcomes that you're hoping for is really going to make your storytelling and the use of your data a lot stronger and actually a little bit easier, so it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming when you know that you have this great program, this great story, these great numbers, but it might feel a little bit difficult to parse it out and figure out which pieces that you need for each outcome. And so hopefully, this is very much a broad overview, but hopefully you can start to see how you can use what you already have and just put different pieces together for different outcomes. And so just as a sort of a summary of that, the elements of messaging, why are you telling the story in the first place? If you don't know that, their story is going to get lost in translation because I don't know why I'm telling this story. And you really want to grab the attention, and that's different for a policymaker, for a funder, for a client, and for the media. And so you really want to also engage them. Why do they care? Are they looking for a new program to fund? Are they legislators who want to know what their voting constituency cares about and is looking for? Or are they going to be clients who really are interested in a program or service that meets their need? And are they the media looking for the next big hook, the big story? So it's very much how is the story going to be shared and what can your audience do and why are they going to be interested in this? So those are very much a broad overview of the elements of messaging and storytelling. And we do have a lot of resources available on NASCAS.org on how to tell these stories. But hopefully this at least is going to get you thinking about how you can continue that energy and all of the sharing that we've done last month in Community Action Month. Since it's not just a month, we realize that we do community action day in and day out. And so if we only tell our story once a year, we're losing out on the other 11 months of the year that we're definitely doing things. So, you know, I do encourage you to think about these elements of messaging and content promotion and how you can use the pieces that you have already to build different messaging strategies.
Great, thank you, Ray. She's really laid the groundwork for us, right? We need to be thinking, what are we trying, what's our message, what story are we trying to tell, who are we telling it to? All those things really matter as we frame up what methodology we're going to be using to communicate. And before we move into the specifics around CSBG reauthorization, we wanted Eleanor to talk a little bit here from Cap Law. When we look at our different audiences, we can say a lot of things on an advocacy framework, and we can say other things in a lobbying framework. And we know that many in the network have questions and concerns about making sure that we're walking the line and doing what we need to do in each side of that fence. So, Eleanor, we're going to turn it over to you to walk us through some of the nuts and bolts around this.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar, and CAPLA is just thrilled to be involved with the other national partners on this initiative. So I guess if we could switch to the next slide. I am Eleanor Evans, Executive Director of CAPLA. But anyway, let's look at this slide here. A lot of times, as Denise mentioned, we at CAPLA get questions about, you know, what's lobbying, what can we do, what can we not do. Now, just to preface it, a lot of the things that Ray was talking about just then are definitely not lobbying. Outreach to clients about programs that you're offering, just kind of educating funders about what you do and your outcomes and that type of thing, that is clearly not lobbying. But then there are some things that community action agencies do, or if they're not doing, should be doing, to lobby for both for our clients and for our programs and to benefit our organization. And that is absolutely permitted. For 501c3 nonprofit community action agencies, 501c3 organizations are absolutely permitted to lobby. Even if you have government funding, you're permitted to lobby as long as you do it with your non-federal funds. With public community action agencies, as I'll get to on another slide, the rules may depend on your state and local government rules. But for the most part, community action agencies and other CSBG network organizations absolutely can lobby. So let's talk about what is and what isn't lobbying. So lobbying is seeking support or seeking opposition to legislation, and legislation that might be at the federal level, that might be at the state level, or it could even be at the local level. So, you know, at the federal level, we're primarily used to lobbying around appropriations for community action programs such as CSBG, Head Start, Weatherization, LIHEAP, and other programs, and then also with reauthorization for our programs. So we have HR 1655 introduced, and we are hoping for reauthorization of CSBG for the first time since 1998. And so, and absolutely community action agencies can lobby on those issues. Just to give some other examples, you know, you may be doing lobbying or may be considering lobbying at your state level. Perhaps there are bills in your state legislatures not only around the budget for your programs, but also around issues facing the clients that we serve. So maybe there's a bill in your state legislature around that would curtail predatory lending in your state, or that would require a living wage to be paid. Or recently here in Massachusetts, we just had legislation to provide for paid sick time for employees in the state of Massachusetts. So there could be a whole host of pieces of legislation that your organization may be interested in lobbying on. Okay, but let's talk. Sometimes it gets a little confusing when we're talking about legislators and when we're interacting with them, whether something is lobbying or not. It may not always be lobbying. So, for example, if you're providing information to your legislators, whether they're your Congress people or your state legislators. If you're just simply providing information on the services that your community action agency provides and telling some of those stories that Ray was talking about just then, about whether it's about individual clients such as George that she mentioned, or whether it is about the overall outcomes that we are achieving, or whether it is about the issues that our clients are facing every day. Just simply providing that information or inviting an incumbent legislator to come to your offices to see what you do, or perhaps to a ribbon cutting ceremony for a new building or something like that, that's not lobbying. But it does turn into lobbying if you do it in the context of asking for support for, say, reauthorization or appropriations or other legislation that you may be interested in. So if, like I said, if you invite a state legislator or a congressperson to come for a ribbon cutting ceremony, and they're there and they just are touring the building and meeting clients, and you have the photo opportunity at the ribbon cutting, again, that's not lobbying. But if while that person is there, you are talking to them about, oh, well, the appropriations bill is pending in Congress, and we'd like you to support CSBG funding at X level, or even if, in the case of appropriations, because those bills come up every year, even if the bill isn't pending, you know that one is going to come up the next year. So even if you say, we hope that you will support increased funding for CSBG, that would be lobbying. Or, if you have the person coming to your ribbon cutting ceremony and you tell them about HR 1655, again, that would be lobbying. So it's either, maybe not the whole time that they're visiting, but, you do need to look at paying for any expenses that are associated with that person's visit, and hopefully there wouldn't be really that many, but there might be some staff time spent on it out of non-federal unrestricted funds. So if we could switch to the next slide. So as I was touching on, really the basic rules on lobbying, again, are that if you're going to be doing lobbying, if you're going to be asking for support for legislation such as HR 1655 or appropriations or other types of legislation, and there are expenses associated with it, whether that's staff time or having staff post stuff on social media, the time that they spend, and a portion of whatever IT expenses you may have with maintaining that social media presence, that would need to be paid out of unrestricted funds again. If you are a 501c3 nonprofit, lobbying cannot be a substantial part of what you do, but that's rarely a problem for community action agencies because of the heavy restrictions that we have on not being able to use our federal funds for lobbying, and the fact that we all receive so much in the way of federal funding. As I referred to before, if you're with a state CSBG office or if you're with a local public community action agency, your ability to lobby is not governed by Section 501c3, but may be governed by your own state or your own local laws and rules on what kind of lobbying you and your staff are allowed to do. In any event, whether you're a nonprofit CAA or a public governmental CAA, you, generally speaking, can't use your federal funds to lobby. There are some very complex exceptions to those rules, but I think for planning purposes, the easiest approach to take is just to consider that we can't use our federal funds to lobby. So if we could switch to the next slide. So what does that mean? So hopefully community action agencies have at least some small amount of unrestricted non-federal funds. And what we at CapLaw recommend is budgeting for the year and looking ahead and maybe looking at prior years and thinking which staff people were engaged in lobbying, and that let's set aside a small portion and pay a small portion of their salaries out of some unrestricted funds to cover the amount of time that they spend working on lobbying issues. And in terms of paying out of unrestricted funds, that includes both folks who are paid out of direct and out of indirect costs. Also, using board members and volunteers is a great way to lobby. So our board members are not receiving compensation. They are not paid out of federal funds, and nor, of course, are our volunteers. So there may be ways to engage them in some of the storytelling activities that Ray was talking about, and in some of the initiatives that Amy will be talking about, and the lobbying that they do would not need to be paid for. Time that your staff spends preparing those folks to do that, however, would need to be paid for and paid out of unrestricted funds. Your employees can also do some lobbying on their own time, and as long as they're not using your organization's resources. But it can get a little tricky here if you're talking about non-exempt employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's just important that you cannot ask non-exempt employees to volunteer or even accept their volunteer time if it's similar to what they do in their day job. And they also cannot engage in lobbying unless you want to pay for it out of your own organization's funds. They can't engage in lobbying during their regular working hours. If you're ready to pay for it and have budgeted a part of their salary to be paid out of unrestricted funds, then absolutely they can do it, but they just need to track it as lobbying. So for example, we here at CAPLA, we track all of our time on the different initiatives we work on, and so we have a category for lobbying, and we put that down and make sure that we're paying for that out of unrestricted funds. Which leads to the next bullet about keeping records of lobbying activities and the costs, and either the source of funding or the fact that no federal funding was used. And also for 501c3 nonprofits, there is some reporting that needs to be done on your annual IRS Form 990. So I know that sounds a little complicated and complex, but really just boils down to use unrestricted funds. Feel free to use board members and volunteers. And if you have questions about it, call CAPLA. And then finally, one great way to do lobbying and to support the network's efforts on lobbying is to join NCAF and to encourage others at your organization to do so as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I think the most important thing that she said was the very first thing she said, right? Community action agencies can and do advocate and lobby, and we are now moving into the steps. So you've heard kind of how to protect yourself, right? We're going to do some of this work that when we get to the nuts and bolts out of non-federal money, unrestricted funds that come into our organization. We're going to think about how we can use board members and volunteers and other folks who might be able to help us carry our message. So let's get to some of the real nuts and bolts of CSBG reauthorization, highlighting and promoting CSBG in general. And with that, we'll turn it over to Amy from NCAF.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. I think it's really special that the four of us are working together on these efforts. As many of you know, NCAF, we are the national advocates for community action agencies across the U.S. And as Cindy said, I'll primarily be talking about the message specifically to your legislators. Okay, so, all right, well, let's start with what we learned from Social Media 101. And Ray covered this a little bit, how to engage with your representative. It should be targeted, it should be specific. What you speak with to your representative is different than what you would talk to with the community at large. Another, websites and social media help community action stay relevant, be more innovative. And third, use social media to highlight successes and community efforts. So why social media? It's their first point of reference. The first thing any legislator, legislative staff is going to do when they hear your name is they're going to Google you. If they go there and the website is hopelessly out of date, you have the annual report from 2011, you don't have social media sites, it reflects poorly on your agency. A lot of agencies, they don't see how critical kind of that first step at the first kind of barrier where they see you is, but it's absolutely critical. We have had, when different agencies have requested meetings with representatives, we've had the representatives reach out to us, ask us, is this a real agency? So it's important to kind of have that effort there so that people know, on the Hill know where you're coming from. and also helps make community action more relevant through the effective branding. Having kind of the community action network together working on these efforts, for example, through Be Community Action, it helps show how we are united as a network, and by each community action agency branding, we help the community action brand in total. It also, as I was saying, it adds credibility and professionalism to your agency and to the network at large. Great, so the do's and don'ts of effective messaging. This, again, is focused on to the Hill, to your representatives. Who are you talking to, as Ray was saying earlier? First and foremost, know your member. Not every legislator is the same. Many of you have several representatives. What are their interests? What committees are they on? Things like that. For example, Representative Cole is interested in rural development, and luckily some of his agencies run rural development programs, and by learning about that, the agency and NCAF can work together on talking about CSBG and community action at large with that information. Stress outcomes, Ray's talked about this quite a bit, so I don't want to go into it too much more. Highlight community partners. One of the biggest strengths community action has is that it's so localized, and so having those community partners and emphasizing them, all it can do is bring strengths. Focus on what distinguishes your agency and your programs. Your agency, as I was saying, very localized, and so the way to talk about a problem that, for example, emerged in your community, maybe there's a new drug in your community, and your agency, because it's so local, was able to address that and put in preventative measures before, you know, other kind of national bodies or other local bodies were able to be a part of it. Those are the kind of stories you should tell. And this is going back to what Ray was saying about George. Be careful when you talk about success stories. It is effective sometimes, but talk about people moving out of poverty. Emphasize independence. Don't put all your eggs in George's basket. And also demonstrate your value to the community. More on George. Don't tell stories of poverty where George received this service, and so did his dad, Ed, and his grandma, Mary. It's important to show that people that have used, that previous clients have moved out of poverty. That's what we want to talk about. So don't discuss just basic administration of programs. And again, on outcomes, don't kind of say, well, we did this without explaining results. Always talk about outcomes. If you say we served 20 people in this program, be ready for the question, what happens then? How did those people succeed? Yeah. Great. So, I'm sorry. I can't see. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so CSBG and CSBG reauthorization. CSBG is the linchpin of the network's funding. It is not only the 5 or 10 or 20% that you get in your budget each year, it is also how the Hill, how federal sources see community action as a unit. It's how NCAF and other national partners can earmark more money or talk about appropriations. It's how we identify you at the national level so that we can continue to make the network bigger and stronger and more innovative. As a few people have already discussed, HR 1655 is CSBG's reauthorization bill in the House, and it's important that you guys all work on that. I think most of you already know. We've sent a lot of emails about it and about Keep Track. If not, please email us and let us know, and we can add you to the information on that. What's important, and again, Ray touched on this a little bit, is social media is not the be-all, end-all. If your website's nice and your social media page is great and you just email your representative and those are the only kind of ways they know you or have access to you, that's not enough. Make sure that you follow through and communicate with your representatives through social media. One quick point, if you're interested in being more active and advocating and lobbying and using the time constraints that Eleanor addressed earlier, please email us, info@ncap.org, if you're interested in being a legislative point person. So one of the best ways that you can engage with your representative on social media is to thank them for co-sponsoring HR 1655, for example, for appropriations, things like that. So right now, can you go back a little? Thank you. So this is the current list. Look for your members. Additionally, today we got 3 more new co-sponsors, very exciting. Representative Mark Takai from Hawaii, Representative Gwen Graham, Florida, and Representative Fred Upton from Michigan. And so if your member is on this list, next slide, thank them, tweet thanks, this is your homework, tweet thanks at, and then look up their username for co-sponsoring HR 1655, the CSBG reauthorization bill. This way, it can multiply your thanks because the representative that sees that already supports the bill, many will probably retweet it, they'll reply, and then their several thousand followers will see it, and it's a way to kind of provide more movement. You go to the next slide. Also, our HR 1655 lead sponsor, Congressman Fitzpatrick, this is his Twitter page. This is your other homework. I'm giving 2 assignments. Sorry. If you could also thank him on Twitter. I'm sure he's been a big champion for us, and he has worked hard to get a lot of members from both sides, but especially from the Republican, other Republican congressmen and women to engage on the bill. So if you could thank him as well.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Those were some, I think, some really great suggestions and some real tangible, easy things for people to do for their homework after today's session. And I just want to reflect a little bit on when you were stressing the kind of the do's and don'ts, right?
Sure.
I mean, those were definitely targeted ideas when you're thinking about your tweets and your posts that you're going to be mentioning House and Senate members. Those are very specific things to keep in mind. Know your member, know what they care about. I would probably add to the list, know what other hashtags perhaps they're paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether it's Talk Poverty, hashtag child care, hashtag affordable housing. There are a lot of hashtag veterans, a lot of really good things that you can add to your tweets. 140 characters can go a long way, longer than you think it does. And there's a lot of places where you can shrink even the size of long web addresses or URLs so you can insert them into your tweets as well. But there are other workshops who can help you figure out those components. I really like the idea of tagging your members. Was it McCain a number of years ago during the State of the Union? People said that he was tweeting and following and all of these things. I mean, they really do pay attention to what's going on if they're tagged in a social media post. If not the member themselves, they're staffers. They have staff always paying attention, and you can set up these things on your smartphones and stuff. So their entire staff are knowing when you're tagging them in your tweets. So if you think @Rep Fitzpatrick today, his team is going to notice that.
Yes.
And if you add a hashtag community action and hashtag CSBG and hashtag thank you, all good. So a lot of good things you can do about that. So what we're going to do here is stop the recording, and then we're going to move into the Q&A phase of today's webinar. So we're going to allow, okay.